Annie Frank. Chapter 1. Living Free. Annie ran down the stairs and onto the street as fast as she could, her skinny legs going at full pelt. She was meant to be doing her homework, but it was so boring. Margaret, her perfect sister, might be happy sticking her nose in a book all day, but Annie wasn't. She stopped when she reached the flat around the corner. Then she sang breathlessly through the letter box, 5 notes up and 5 notes down. It was her secret signal. The next moment, Liz Gassler, her best friend, opened the door. Annie caught hold of her hand and pulled her outside. "Come on," she said. "Let's go and play." Their friend Sunny and a crowd of other children were already cut on the sunny Amsterdam streets. Some were rolling hoops, others playing hopscotch or doing handstands against the wall. Annie was hopeless at handstands, but knew another way to get everyone's attention. "Watch this!" she cried, lifting her arm high in the air. Annie waited until everyone was looking at her. Then she swung her arm around as fast as she could. There was a loud crack, and her shoulder popped straight out of its socket. All the boys laughed and cheered. Hearing the sound of laughter, Annie's mother, Edith, glanced out the window and caught sight of Annie on the street below. "I bet that girl hasn't done her homework," she thought with a sigh. It was always such a struggle with Annie. Even though her daughter was only 7, Edith was certain she would be a social butterfly all her life. Still, she was glad Annie had settled into Amsterdam life so easily. It was 3 years since the Franks had left Germany, but Edith still missed her home. And as long as the Nazi party ruled Germany, they couldn't go back. The Franks were Jewish and the Nazis hated Jews. Recently, the Nazis had fired Jews from their jobs, shut down Jewish shops, and beaten up Jews on the street. "We were right to leave when we did," thought Edith. "We couldn't have brought up our children in such a country." That night, Annie's father, Otto, put Annie to bed as usual. "Tell me a story," Annie pleaded. "Can I have one about good Paula and naughty Paula? But this time tell me about naughty Paula. She's more fun." "Margaret prefers good Paula," Otto remarked. "Well, she would," Annie replied. Happily, it was hard having Margaret as an older sister. She never got into trouble and was always neat and tidy. Otto guessed what she was thinking. "You could be good too, Annie. You just have to learn to control yourself." "I'll try, Daddy, I promise," Annie said. "Anything to make you happy." Otto laughed. "You little flatterer," he said, kissing her on the head. The next day at school, Annie tried harder than usual to concentrate. She loved school really, the big airy classroom, the bright red flower pots on the windowsill. It was just so much more fun to talk to people than to listen to the lessons. "Annie Frank, you are such a chatterbox," scolded her teacher. "I can't help it, Mr. Kinsey," Annie replied. "It's a female thing. My mother talks as much as I do, and I inherited my talkativeness from her." Everyone laughed, including the teacher. When Annie got back, Edith was bustling around the kitchen, preparing supper. "We have guests tonight," she said. "Who's coming?" Annie asked eagerly. "Miep, from Daddy's work, and her friend Jane." "Hooray!" Annie cried. She loved it when people came over. As soon as the doorbell rang, Annie rushed to let them in. The next moment, she was preparing them with questions. "How are you, Miep? How was your day? What's it like working for Daddy?" Hello, Jane. Then Annie stopped and looked at them both, her brown eyes sparkling with interest. Ooh, are you Mip's boyfriend? She asked. Quiet, Annie, interrupted Edith. Time for supper, added Otto gently. As soon as the meal was over, Annie and Margaret were sent to bed. I expect they want to talk politics, said Margaret. Or some sort of secret, Annie suggested. Politics is boring. But things are getting worse, Margaret explained. It's all because of Hitler, the Nazi party leader. He's making the Nazi more powerful than ever. They're building up a huge army. Mommy's worried Hitler will invade the Netherlands one day, Margaret went on. What does Daddy think? Asked Annie. He thinks we're safe here. Good, said Annie. Then I won't worry about it either. Besides, she added, I haven't got time for Hitler. I've got the summer holidays to think about. Month of swimming and sunbathing. I can wait. Chapter 2 Broken Glass. At the start of the new school term, Annie and Alice walked to school together as usual. Annie curled and twirled her hair around her fingers as she talked, casting smiles at the boy beside them. Annie Frank! Exclaimed Alice in a loud whisper. You are such a flirt! No, I'm not, Annie giggled. Then stop looking at that boy. But he's looking at me, Annie retorted. Besides, I can't help it if he likes me. You just love people paying you attention, said Alice, laughing. Annie felt she was having the best year ever. For her, 1937 was a golden time. She had a throng of friends, girls and boys. And there were family trips to the lakes and to Switzerland to see their cousins. But as time passed, fear began to lurk at the back of Annie's mind, much as she tried to crush it. Aged 9, she overheard scraps of terrifying news from the grown ups' conversations. They whispered about friends in Nazi Germany who had been rounded up and taken away to work in places called concentration camps. No one had heard from them since. Words like Kristallnacht, night of broken glass, rang in her head. Annie knew that on Kristallnacht, Jews in Germany had been beaten up, and the windows of Jewish old shops and homes had been smashed in. The dark streets had glittered like a nightmare with shards of broken glass. Safe in Amsterdam, the Franks tried to lead a normal life, but the following year, 1939, Edith was more worried than ever. First, Hitler invaded Poland. Now, Britain's declared war on Germany. It might be us next. What will happen then? Send the girls to us, wrote Otto's cousin Milly from England. I know we're at war, but if you think it's the least bit safe, please send the children here. But although Edith and Otto discussed it, they decided to stay together as a family. We couldn't bear to part with the girls, Otto wrote back. They mean too much to us. The following May, Annie and Margaret had their photographs taken as usual. Annie spent a happy afternoon sticking the photos into her album. She studied them carefully. Now she was 11. Annie took her appearance very seriously. She learned to look glamorous. Beside each one, she scribbled a note. But later that night, she couldn't sleep. The air was filled with a strange droning noise. She looked at her clock. It said 4 in the morning. The next moment there was a massive explosion, followed by another and then another. Annie raced into her parents' room. "What's happening?" she cried. Her parents were standing with Margaret, staring out of their bedroom window. Annie went to look too. A swarm of planes was streaming across the sky. In the distance, fires burned and the smell of smoke seeped in through the open window. Otto put his arm around Annie and held her close. "There are German planes, Annie," he said. "Hitler's invading." Chapter 3: Invasion. Until daybreak, German and Dutch planes fought over Amsterdam skies. That morning, the streets were filled with panic. As people tried to find out what was happening, others stayed glued to their radios. The next few days were punctuated with the piercing wail of air raid sirens, warning everyone to take cover. The sirens were always followed by the sound of exploding bombs. Annie lay awake most nights, shaking with fear. Then came the announcement on the radio. "Germans threaten to bomb the city of Rotterdam unless we surrender." 2 hours before the deadline expired, the Germans bombed Rotterdam anyway. 900 people were killed. Fearing further bombings, the Netherlands surrendered just 4 days after Hitler had invaded. At first, life carried on as normal, but little by little, things did begin to change. It was announced that Jews had to register themselves, so the Nazis could find out exactly where they lived. Soon after, the Nazis began to pass anti-Jewish laws. Annie was furious. "We can do anything," she grumbled to Liz and Sandy. "We have to walk everywhere. We're not allowed into parks or swimming pools." "I hate it," agreed Liz. They had spent the morning flicking through fashion magazines and gossiping. Now they wanted to go out, but echoing down the street, they heard the stamp of marching footsteps. A group of Dutch Nazis were walking by, wearing their uniforms with pride. The girls hid from view until the footsteps faded into silence. They'd heard stories of what Nazi soldiers did to Jews. "Do you want to come up and see my outfit for me and Jane's wedding?" Annie suggested, to break the silence. They raced inside. Annie proudly showed them her new coat and hat. "And," she added excitedly, "I'm going to have a new hairstyle for the occasion." Annie felt that whenever she was with her friends, she had to stay cheerful. Margaret, on the other hand, grew quieter than ever. At the end of that summer, all the Jewish children from any school were kept behind after assembly. The headmistress faced them from the front of the room. "I'm afraid you won't be allowed to return to this school next term," she began, her hands clasping and unclasping as she spoke. "The Nazis have passed a new law. Jewish children can no longer go to school with non-Jews." Annie let out a cry and sobbed into her hands. She loved her school. Why did she have to leave? She'd never see any of her non-Jewish friends now. When Annie got home, Otto and Edith did their best to comfort her. "We'll send you and Margaret to the Jewish Lyceum," Edith told her. "It's so far away," Annie cried. I know," said Edith. "Please don't worry though. We must try to keep our lives as normal as possible." But even loving parents were powerless to stop what was happening. The following spring, the Nazis passed yet another law. All Jews had to sew a yellow star onto their clothes, with the word Jude on it, the Dutch for Jew. "I'm scared to do anything now in case it's forbidden," said Annie's friend Jack. Annie knew just how she felt. That year, the Franks celebrated the Jewish festival of Passover with the Van Pels family. Otto and Mr. Van Pels worked together, and suddenly it seemed as if the Van Pelses were always at the Franks' house, the parents talking together in hushed voices. Annie didn't take much notice. She was determined to have some fun still. She formed a ping-pong club with Jack, Liz, Sandy, and her friend Eve, playing on the dining room table at Eve's house. Annie also had her birthday to look forward to. She was going to be 13. I already know what I'm getting, Annie told Liz. I chose it myself. It's an autograph book, but I'm going to use it as a diary and write all my secrets in it. On the morning of Annie's birthday, Liz came by to walk to school with Annie. Peering into Frank's sitting room to see Annie's presents, Liz noticed, not for the first time, how bare the room looked. The Franks must be selling off their furniture, Liz thought. Perhaps they need the money. That night, Annie wrote in her diary for the first time, I hope I shall be able to confide in you completely, as I have never been able to do in anyone before, and I hope you will be a great source of comfort and support. Otto was glad his daughter had a diary. He thought she would need it in the month to come. We may have to go into hiding, he said, as they strolled down the streets together, even though it will be hard for us to live cut off from the rest of the world. What do you mean? Annie asked. You know how we've been sending our clothes and furniture to other people, Otto began. I thought that was just to stop the Nazis taking them. Well, yes, Otto replied, but we don't want the Nazis to take us too, so we'll live on our own, not wait for them to get us. Annie looked scared. But when, Daddy? Don't worry, we'll take care of everything. Just enjoy your carefree life while you can. Annie didn't reply. She was desperately hoping that day was still a long way off. A week later, Annie was lying on a flat roof, lazily reading in the sun, when Margaret rushed up to her. Father's received a call up from the Nazis, she said breathlessly. Mother's gone to see Mr. Van Pels. Annie could feel her body start to shake. Everyone knew what a call up was. It meant being sent to a concentration camp, and no one ever came back from those. He's not going, Margaret declared. Mother's gone to ask Mr. Van Pels if we can go to our hiding place tomorrow. The Van Pelses are going with us, she added. Annie and Margaret sat in tense silence, waiting for their mother to return. Annie kept thinking of their father, visiting friends at the Jewish hospital, with no idea what was happening. I lied, Margaret burst out suddenly. The call up wasn't for father, it was for me. Annie was so shocked that she started to cry. It's because I'm 16 now. The Nazis are sending girls my age away. Daddy won't let you go, said Annie. No, Margaret sank into her chair, then sprang up again. We'd better start packing. Annie found herself shoving the craziest things in her bag. Hair colors, school books, some old letters. She couldn't concentrate. She was bursting with questions. Where will we go? She began. Where will we hide? Margaret began to explain what was going to happen. Mr. Klingman and Mr. Kugler from Daddy's work are going to help us. So are Meep and Jane and Daddy's secretary Bab. Otto finally came back late that afternoon. Meep arrived too and took with her bags full of clothes, promising to return later. The family sat together in silence. It was so hot, and everything felt very strange. Even though Annie knew it was her last night in her old bed, she fell straight to sleep. Early the next morning, she was gently shaken awake by her mother. It's time to go, darling, she said. Outside, a warm rain had started to fall. The four Franks emerged from their house wearing as many of their clothes as possible. They couldn't take suitcases, or the Nazis would be onto them in a moment. Annie felt sure she was going to suffocate. Margaret rode ahead on her bicycle. At last, Annie's parents told her where they were going. The hiding place is in Daddy's office building, Edith told her. We were going to move next month, when everything would have been ready, but we have to go now because of Margaret's call up. In Daddy's office building? Annie queried. Yes, there's a secret annex at the back of the building. No one would guess it, but there are lots of rooms there. As soon as they arrived, Meep quickly led them through the office, down a long passage and up a wooden staircase. There, behind another door, lay the annex. Chapter 4. The Secret Annex. 5 months later, Annie was lying in bed, staring up at her bedroom wall. She had covered it with photographs of her family and her pictures of movie stars to make it seem more like home. It's amazing, Annie was thinking. There are 8 people all living in this tiny space. A week after the Franks moved in, the Van Pelses had come to join them. Mr. Van Pels tells terrible jokes and Mrs. Van Pels is always scolding me. Annie grumbled to herself. It's a shame there's son. Peter is so dull. But it's good to have other people around. If only I didn't have to share a room with the exasperating Mr. Pfeffer. As Annie turned, her bed made a loud creaking noise. Shh, shh, muttered Pfeffer from his side of the narrow room. Annie clenched her fists. Next time he shushes me, she thought, I'm going to shush him right back. But I know I mustn't moan. I must be reasonable. Fritz Pfeffer had arrived in November, 4 months after the Franks. The Van Pelses had immediately presented him with a guide to the secret annex. Fritz needed to learn the rules of the annex quickly, so he didn't put everyone in hiding at risk. As soon as Pfeffer arrived, everyone pelted him with questions about the outside world. Things are getting worse for the Jews, he told them. Night after night, the Nazis cruise the streets. They break into people's houses, looking for Jews in hiding. Anyone found is taken away to the camp at Westerbork. There was silence after that. Miep had told them about Westerbork. The people there hardly got anything to eat, and the camps in Poland were even more terrible. The radio said Jews were being gassed there. Perhaps that's the quickest way to die, thought Annie. It's so quiet here, and we're safe, at least for now. I should be grateful we're the lucky ones. But it was hard to be grateful all the time. Being cooped up all day meant arguments broke out frequently, and Annie hated having to tiptoe around each day, keeping her voice to a whisper. I longed to be able to move around freely again. She confided it to her diary. She was terrified, too, that they'd be discovered and shot. As the war dragged on, things seemed to be getting worse. News reports on the radio told of battles being fought in Africa, Russia, Italy. The whole world is at a war, Annie wrote in her diary, and the end is nowhere in sight. When Annie peeked out from behind the curtains now, the children on the streets looked ragged and starving. As the month passed, food became scarcer and scarcer. It was only the efforts of their helpers that kept the members of the annex alive. Every day, Meep went out on her bicycle to find food for them all, often queuing for hours just to get a loaf of bread, while Bab smuggled in milk from the office supply. And every Saturday, Meep brought 5 books from the library. You have no idea how we long for Saturdays, Annie told Meep. Books mean everything when you are cooped up. We couldn't do without your visits either, she added. Annie knew that the office staff risked their lives to help them, for the sake of their helpers and for the others in hiding. Annie tried to stay cheerful and brave, but at times she felt as if her personality were splitting in two. When she was with the others, she laughed and joked and chatted away. Only when she was on her own, writing her diary, did she feel free to reveal her serious side. Sometimes she would flood her diary with her despair. The atmosphere is stifling, sluggish, leaden, she wrote. A deathly, oppressive silence hangs over the house and clings to me as if it were going to drag me into the deepest regions of the underworld. I wander from room to room, climb up and down the stairs, and feel like a songbird whose wings have been ripped off and who keeps hurling itself against the bars of its dark cage. One night, Annie dreamed of lies. She was dressed in rags, her face thin and wan. She looked at Annie with such sadness in her eyes. Help me, she seemed to say. Rescue me from this hell. But I can't help you, Annie called out. I can only stand by and watch while you and other Jews suffer and die. When Annie woke, she was crying. What's happened to Liz? She thought. She's probably been taken away to the camps. Why have I been chosen to leave? Well, she's probably going to die. For days after, Annie kept seeing those enormous eyes. They haunted her. She longed to talk to someone. That is the only one who understands me, she thought. He's the most wonderful father in the world, but I can talk to mother. I feel so distant from her and Margaret now. After a while, she thought maybe she could talk to Peter. They began to spend more and more time together. Peter was shy and withdrawn, but gradually Annie won his confidence. They would sit together by the window in the attic, looking out at the blue sky, the bare chestnut tree glistening with dew, the seagulls and other birds that glinted with silver as they swooped through the air. They looked in silence, Annie feeling entranced by a spell that shouldn't be broken with words. Whenever Annie felt sad or frustrated, she and Peter would go up to the attic. As long as you look fearlessly at the sky, Annie wrote in her diary, you will know that you are pure within and will find happiness once more. Annie's writing meant everything to her now. She poured out her thoughts and feelings into her diary and began to write stories of her own. Short stories, fairy stories, the start of a novel. I'll tell you what, Annie announced over the kitchen table one morning. Being in hiding from 2 years is no picnic, especially in this war. Her voice sounded muffled. She was speaking through a handkerchief. What is that smell? Asked Margaret. Lunch, replied Mrs. Van Pels. We're out of oil, and as of tomorrow we won't have a scrap of butter. Today we're eating mashed potato and pickled kale. Ugh, exclaimed Annie. The thought of eating this mug makes me feel sick. Perhaps you should spend more time on your schoolwork, like Margaret, said Mrs. Van Pels. Then you'd have your studies to occupy your thoughts. She's just jealous because I'm so close to Peter, Annie thought. But deep down, she knew she hadn't been bothering with her studies. Her thoughts had been filled with Peter, and there seemed no point in schoolwork. With the end of the war so far away, like a fairy tale, That night, Annie thought about what she really wanted out of life. To be a writer, she realized. 2 months later, the members of the secret annex were crowded around the radio. Today is D-Day, announced the BBC. This is it, cried Otto. The invasion has begun. British and American troops have landed in France. Friends are on their way, said Annie. There's hope, breathed Margaret. The war is coming to an end. Imagine, Annie, by October we could be back at school. The summer passed in great excitement. News reports came in thick and fast of invasion successes against the Germans. Sometimes Annie felt overwhelmed by the chaos and suffering reported on the radio. But when she looked up at the sky, she felt that somehow everything would change for the better, that peace would return once more. In spite of everything, Annie wrote in her diary, I still believe that people are good at heart. Chapter 5 Westerbork August 4, 1944 was a warm, still summer's day. At the headquarters of the Nazi secret police, the telephone rang. An officer picked up the receiver and listened for a while. Then he quickly left the building, accompanied by a number of Dutch police. They parked outside Otto's office and marched into the building. We know everything, the Nazi officer announced. You are hiding Jews and they are in this building. Take us to them. Helplessly, Victor Kugler, the Frank's friend and helper, took the police up to the annex. The police went into each of the rooms, rounding everyone up, forcing them to put their hands in the air. Margaret wept softly. An hour later, they were out on the street, along with Kugler and Clayman, being ordered into a police van. I'm sorry, Otto said to Clayman on their way to prison, to think that you are sitting here among us, that we are to blame. Don't give it another thought, Clayman interrupted him. I wouldn't have done it any differently. Clayman and Kugler were taken away for questioning. After 3 days in filthy, overcrowded prisons, the 8 members of the annex were sent on a train to Westerbork. At least we're still together, said Otto, after the numbness of the past few days. Annie felt strangely cheerful. Perhaps the war will end before they can send us to the death camps, she thought. And right now, right this moment, I'm outside. I feel almost free. I can feel the sun on my face again. At Westerbork, the Franks lined up to register. They were marked down as criminals for being in hiding and sent to one of the punishment blocks. There, they were stripped of their clothes and handed blue overalls, marked with red thread to show they were criminals, and given wooden clogs to wear. Then the men had their heads shaved, and the women had their hair shorn painfully short. Annie minded dreadfully about losing her hair. Otto was sent to the men's barracks. Edith, Margaret, and Annie to the women's. Don't worry, Edith told her daughters. We'll still see Daddy in the evenings. Yes, whispered Annie, clinging to her mother as if she were a small child again. Each day, work began at 5 in the morning, chopping up metal batteries. Annie was horrified when she realized what they had to do. Chop open the batteries with a chisel and a hammer, they were told. put tar in one basket and carbon bars in the other. It was messy work. The batteries gave off a kind of dust, and Margaret and Annie couldn't stop coughing. But at least we can talk, Annie said to the girls Jenny and Leatia, sitting next to her. For lunch, they received a piece of stale bread and a few spoonfuls of watery soup. Margaret eyed it dolefully. I never thought we'd actually be caught, she said. I know, Annie replied, but let's stay hopeful. The end of the war must come soon. If we can just stay here, we'll survive. Otto helped calm his daughters too, visiting them at night to tell them stories. A month later, a feeling of panic flooded through the camp. There was to be another transport out of Westerbork to a camp in the east. A long train of cattle trucks rode into Westerbork that night. By 11 the next morning, 1,019 people had been loaded on, and the doors bolted shut. The Van Pelses, Pfeffer, and the Franks were among them. Chapter 6. The Camps. The Franks stood pressed against the wall, clutching their bags. Cracks of light came in through grates of rusted wire netting. The journey went on and on. People jostled around, trying to get near the crack in the door, to get away from the stench. Annie was horribly tired and stiff. She wanted to lie down on the floor, but Otto wouldn't let her. You'll be stepped on, he said. Annie saw that it was true. Every time someone tried to sit, feet trampled on them from all sides. Lean on me when you are tired, Otto said. Every now and then, Annie was able to climb up and peer through the rusted wire netting. She caught glimpses of beautiful endless cornfields. For a moment, she was able to forget she was on a train in the midst of a war. Edith was busy with their overalls. She was trying to unpick the red thread, hoping that without it they could pretend they weren't convict prisoners. No one knew which camp the train was going to. Perhaps Auschwitz in Poland. Some whispered. It was a name that filled everyone with dread. At the end of the third day, in the gathering dark, the train finally came to a stop. Rifle butts pounded on the door. Jews out! Jews out! Shouted male voices. Climbing out with stiff limbs, the first thing Annie saw was the glare of bright, bluish neon lights. Women to one side, men to the other, said a voice over a loudspeaker. With whips and cudgel, guards forced the men and the women apart. Annie was shunted away from her father. Looking around, the last glimpse Otto had of his daughters were Margaret's eyes, filled with terror. Next came another shout. Get into rows of 5! A tall man with gleaming polished boots divided the women into 2 columns. One column was made up of the very old and the very young. Guards marched them away. Everyone else, including Annie, her mother, and sister, were forced to walk in a different direction. On the way, they passed buildings with huge clouds of black smoke pouring from the chimneys, and there was a smell, a horrible, horrible smell. This is a death camp, Annie realized. They kill people here. And that's where they burn the bodies, someone said behind her. At the camp, They were stripped, forced to shower, and then shaved. Lastly, they were handed sack-like dresses and made to line up, so that each woman in turn could have a number tattooed on their arm. Annie, Margaret, and Edith were sent to their barracks, block number 29. As Annie took in their new surroundings, she almost gagged. The stench of urine was everywhere. Every morning, they woke at 3:30 to the sound of sharp whistles. Breakfast was a brown liquid slopped into their bowls. Morning and night, in all weathers, they stood outside for their roll call, which could last for up to 5 hours. Margaret and Annie always stood together, both very quiet and withdraw. Then they marched half an hour to work, to dig an area of grass. There was no point to the work, but the head prisoners, the couples, ran among them screaming, "Faster! Faster!" For supper, they had a slice of bread. It was Annie's job to distribute the bread among their block, which she always did fairly. At 10, they went into their barracks to try to sleep. Edith's only thought now was for her daughters. She begged extra food for them when she could and kept them close to her. Then the news came that another selection was to be made, this time to a factory where the work was less demanding. Annie was rejected as she had scabies, red sores on her body, where lice had burrowed beneath her skin. Edith and Margaret refused to go without her, and Margaret chose to go into the scabies barracks with Annie to keep her company. Edith was in despair without them. Each night she went to the scabies barracks and dug a hole in the soft earth, so she could pass scraps of food to the children. By now, Margaret had scabies too. Days later, another selection was made. Edith, as an old woman, was kept behind at Auschwitz, but Margaret and Annie were sent on. The moment had come when Edith would be parted from her daughters. She had no idea if she would see them again. The children, oh God! She screamed after them. Annie and Margaret were headed onto a train once more. No one knew where they were going, and it was bitterly cramped and cold. 4 days later, they arrived at the Bergen-Belsen camp in Germany. There, Annie and Margaret were put to work in a show shed and stitching shoes by hand. The work made Annie's hands bleed. Once again, they were existing only on a bowl of so-called soup and a slice of bread. Annie grew thinner and thinner. She seemed to consist only of her eyes, eyes with a greenish glint. But the girls weren't broken yet. At Bergen-Belsen, they met up with Jenny and Leontija, who they knew from Westerbork. Together, the Dutch girls celebrated Christmas, Hanukkah, New Year, all at once. They saved scraps of food, sang songs, and told stories. Everyone tried their best not to cry, even though they were thinking about their loved ones. A barbed wire fence ran through the middle of the camp. The conditions on the other side of the wire were meant to be slightly better. One day, Annie was told a girl she knew was in the other camp, and that she wanted to meet Annie at the wire fence. Annie approached the wire, cold, hungry, shaven-headed, even though she knew the guards would shoot her just for going there. In the fading evening light, Annie could just make out lights on the other side. She began to cry. I don't have any parents anymore, she sobbed. Liz sobbed too. She told Annie her mother had died and that her father was sick in hospital. We don't have anything to eat here, Annie went on, and they've taken all our clothes. Meet me at 8 tomorrow evening. I'll bring you food. The following night, Liz threw Annie a package over the fence, but Annie let out a cry. What's happened? Liz called. Another woman caught it, Annie replied, and she won't give it back. The next evening, Liz threw Annie another bundle full of food. This time, Annie caught it, but that was the last time Liz and Annie saw each other. Margaret had fallen ill with dysentery and was sent to the sick bay. Annie went with her. Don't go there, Leontia told her. You'll die. But it was warm in the sick bay, and there were only two of them in one bunk. We are together and we have our peace, Annie said. Margaret hardly said anything. She had a fever and her mind was wandering, but she smiled weakly. That March, another disease spread through Bergen-Belsen. This time it was typhus. Annie and Margaret both caught it. They lay in the bunk by the barrack door, where the cold wind came stinging. Other inmates heard their cries. Close the door, close the door. Leontia and Jenny came to visit them. Margaret had fallen from her bunk the night before and was only half conscious. Annie was feverish but loving. Margaret will sleep well, and when she sleeps, I don't need to get up any more. Margaret was too weak to survive the fall, and the shock killed her. After that, Annie gave in to her illness. She died sometime in March. Thinking her mother and father were dead, believing herself alone in the world.